Welcome to our YouTube channel. In this video, we'll show you how to prepare the environment for a Greengage DB cluster, build Greengage DB from the source code, configure and initialize a cluster, load sample data, and set up access to allow users to make requests to the cluster. 4 hosts will be used to demonstrate the initialization of the Greengage DBMS. One host will serve as the primary coordinator, another as the standby coordinator, and the remaining 2 will act as segment hosts. Each segment host will run 2 primary and 2 mirror segment instances. For example, segment 0 and segment 1 will be located on the first segment host, while their corresponding mirrors will reside on the second segment host to ensure high availability. Before initializing the cluster, it's necessary to prepare all the hosts. In this tutorial, we use 4 machines running Ubuntu 22.04. We've already logged into each host using a user account with sudo privileges. The first step is to create a dedicated user account to initialize and manage the Greengage DB cluster. This user is typically named GPadmin. Start by creating the GPadmin group. Then create the system user GPadmin, add it to the group, and set a password for the user. Next, adjust the operating system parameters. For this demo, you'll need to configure a subset of the required settings to ensure the cluster runs smoothly. Open the sysctl.conf file and add the following parameters. After saving the file, apply the changes using the sysctl command. Next, open the limits.conf file and add the following lines to increase resource limits for the Greengage DBMS. These settings define the maximum number of open files and processes that the GPadmin user can use concurrently. To enable passwordless SSH from the coordinator host to all other hosts in the cluster, password authentication must be temporarily allowed. To ensure the SSH configuration isn't overridden by settings from other files, comment out the include directive in the sshd config file. Then set password authentication to yes. Apply the changes by restarting the sshd service. Next, define hostname resolution for all cluster hosts by manually updating the etc hosts file on each machine. That completes the operating system configuration. Remember, all the steps above must be performed on every host in the cluster. Now, you're ready to build Greengage DB from the source code. First, verify that Git is installed. Then use the git clone command to clone the Greengage repository. After cloning, navigate to the Greengage directory and check out the latest tag, currently 7.3.0. The repository includes a set of bash scripts for installing the necessary dependencies to build Greengage DB on different operating systems. Run the script specific to Ubuntu to install the required packages. Once the dependencies are in place, verify that a locale for English, United States, with UTF-8 encoding is available on your system. Next, configure the build environment by running the configure script with the appropriate options. For example, the with LDAP option enables LDAP support in Greengage DBMS. Once the configuration is complete, compile Greengage DB by running the make command. This process may take several minutes. If the compilation finishes successfully, you'll see a confirmation message in the output. To install Greengage DB, run make install. After installation, change the ownership of the installed files to the GPadmin user and group. To make all Greengage DB command line tools available, you need to update the path environment variable by sourcing the appropriate setup script. This step can be done later after switching to the GPadmin user. The final step to perform as a sudo user is to create the data storage directories on all cluster hosts. A data storage area is where Greengage DB stores data for the coordinator and segment instances. On the coordinator host, create the Data1 coordinator directory and change its ownership to the GP admin user. Repeat the same steps on the standby coordinator host. On each segment host, create the Data1 primary and Data1 mirror directories and change their ownership to the GP admin user. You're now almost ready to initialize the cluster. Switch to the GP admin user. To make Greengage DB command line tools available, you need to update the path environment variable and set several other environment variables. Open the bash rc file and add the following lines. The Greengage path script sets or updates key environment variables, including GP home, specifies the directory where Greengage DB is installed. Path updates the system path to include directories that contain Greengage DB utilities. The coordinator data directory variable specifies the directory that will be created during cluster initialization. Other variables such as PG port, PG user, and PG database are optional and can be used to configure default connection settings for accessing the database. After editing the profile file, be sure to source it to apply the changes immediately. The GP admin user must have an SSH key pair generated on each cluster host. This enables passwordless SSH, allowing the user to connect from any host to any other host in the cluster without entering a password or passphrase. To generate the keys, use the SSH keygen utility, accepting the default file paths and leaving the passphrase empty. Repeat this process on all cluster hosts. Next, create host files required by various Greengage DB utilities for cluster-wide operations. These files list the host names or IP addresses of cluster nodes. Start by creating the host file all host file, which should contain all cluster host names. Then create the host file segment hosts file, listing only the segment hosts. To enable passwordless SSH from the coordinator host to every other host in the cluster, use the SSH copy ID utility. This copies the GP admin user's public key to the authorized keys file on the target host. When prompted, enter the GP admin user's password for the target host and press enter. Repeat this process for segment hosts. To enable passwordless SSH between all hosts in the cluster, use the GP SSH xkeys utility. Provide it with the host file containing the names of all cluster hosts by passing the file name as an argument to the command. You're almost ready to initialize the cluster. The next step is to create the database configuration file that guides the initialization utility on how to set up Greengage DBMS. Some of the key settings in this configuration file include seg prefix, the prefix used to name data directories for both coordinator and segment instances. Port base, the base port number from which primary segment port numbers are calculated. Data directory, the storage location where the initialization utility creates data directories for primary segments. Coordinator directory, the storage location where the initialization utility creates the coordinator data directory. Coordinator port, the port number on which the coordinator instance listens for client connections to Greengage DBMS. Save and close the file. To initialize Greengage DBMS, use the GP init system utility. The C option is used to pass the database configuration file name. The H option specifies the name of the host file with segment hosts. The S option specifies the host name of the standby coordinator host. The N option is used to initialize DBMS with the specified locale. Press Enter to proceed. The GP init system utility will verify your setup by checking connectivity to each host and confirming access to the data directories specified in the configuration file. It will then display the cluster configuration that will be applied. If all pre-checks pass successfully, the utility will prompt you to confirm the configuration. Type Y and press Enter to begin the initialization process. Once the setup is completed successfully, GP-init system will start your Greengage DBMS and display a confirmation message. To verify that all instances are up and running, use the GP state command to check the cluster status. Use the pSQL utility to list the default databases created during cluster initialization. Verify the collate and C-type columns to ensure all databases have the correct locale settings. Next, connect to the default Postgres database and retrieve version information about the installed Greengage DB. Then, query the GP Segment Configuration System table to view details about mirroring and segment instant configuration, including the primary coordinator, standby coordinator, and both primary and mirror segment instances. Before loading sample data, create a new database and connect to it. Create an orders table with the customer ID column defined as the distribution key. The distribution key controls how data is distributed across segments, enabling efficient parallel query execution. Insert 100,000 rows into the table. To ensure uniform data distribution after the initial load, use the getAODistribution function. This will display the number of rows stored on each segment. Next, create a database user named sample user with a password and grant them select privileges on the orders table to allow access to the data. Then, from a local machine, attempt to connect to the coordinator host as sample user using pSQL. A connection error indicates that the pghba.conf file on the coordinator host needs to be updated to allow access for this user. Switch back to the coordinator host and exit the pSQL session. Open the pghba.conf file in a text editor and add the following line to allow sample user to connect to the coordinator instance using password authentication. After saving the changes, reload the configuration by running gpstop with the U option to apply the updates. Next, switch back to the local machine and try connecting to the coordinator instance again using pSQL. You should now be prompted for sample user password and, upon successful authentication, be able to log in and query the orders table. And that's it. To learn more, visit greengagedb.org for our roadmap, latest releases, blog updates, and documentation. And don't forget to check out the project on GitHub. Your feedback and contributions are always welcome. Thanks for watching.